Good morning, Nick Parente. How are you doing?
Good morning, Jan Recker. I'm doing well.
That's great. Yeah, look, in our podcast, we've had like what 20 episodes by far, and I have to admit grudgingly that it's always you that coins the best phrases.
I do?
Yeah, I think so. You're loud and boisterous, but every now and then you come up with this real beautiful, eloquent gem. And here's an example. Last episode, just in passing, you said we talked about other things. We talked about how to theorize about new technology, but you mentioned in passing, you said affordances is the new TAM.
Hmm. I
And that
said
made
that.
me.
All right.
You said that, and you made me giggle for like a week. Because I think you're right. Affordance is our new TAM. We in the past we talked about TAM and how that was the thing of the past, and we moved beyond it. But we haven't really. We just substituted it with some other theory, and the new TAM is affordance theory, isn't it?
Well, all right. So first off, thank you for giving me some credit for being clever. Except that I don't think I coined that. I think it's our friend Stefan Zyto
Oh, is that
who
yeah? Oh,
who
yeah.
said it to me perhaps over drinks one day, and as a provocation. And I think he deserves the credit, but he's not here, so I'll take the credit. All right,
Oh,
forget
you
that.
take the credit, but if it's his doing, and I can totally see, he actually coined a few phrases on this podcast as well, because he also said the main IS journalist, the Journal of Information Technology,
That's
JIT.
right. That's
Anyway,
right.
so but whoever said it first.
But anyway, this is what I think should. So forget him. I think if anybody's going to reference affordances as the new TAM, they should cite Berenti Recker 2021.
Podcast 2021. Absolutely.
Yeah, and forget him. All right. So and before we get into this, I want to say you sound clearer and louder than in any previous podcast. And I hope to God we have solved our audio problems because you sound really good to me today for the first time in your life. So
For the first time in my life. Well, thank you. I invested some money into digital infrastructure, and
see.
that's not a problem because we make heaps of money with this. So, I
Yeah.
thought I'd
Oh, yeah. We
reinvest
make
some
so
of that.
we make so much money with this pod. You all right? For anybody listening, Recker basically bankrolls the whole thing himself.
Yeah, but dude,
uh,
let's be clear. It's not really a high. It's not
that's
really
true.
a high price that we pay. But yeah, it's fine.
All
But I
right.
did invest in a new microphone, and here we go. Let's see how this goes.
So we're derailing, right? And here's the argument for. So if you recall, TAM, we make fun of TAM. Not because it wasn't a good foundational theory for information systems. It's just that it got a bit saturated and that and even your dissertation, right? You used some TAM, but it's about technology acceptance. And we argued in a previous podcast that, is acceptance really the key issue anymore? We've accepted technology. It's more about how you use it and what you do with it, and maybe that's given rise to this idea of affordance as the new kind of lens for. We don't really. Of course, they're going to accept it or not. That's less relevant. What's important is how they use it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we sort of shifted from the question, which was a real question at that time, like how do we get people to adopt new information technology? So I don't want to take anything away from TAM. It was very useful at the time, and in a way, it was a very successful, very fertile theory. It spawned research for decades by hundreds and thousands of people. So if we make fun of it now, it's from the point of view of hindsight.
Right.
So now I think the conversation has moved to, okay, what's going on when we use technology? Because a lot of that is not as deterministic, not as linear. It's unforeseen. People appropriate it differently, etc. So all sorts of things happen, some of which was intended, some of which was not. It sort of started, you remember that when mobile phones came up and people started using SMS services.
Yeah.
And then the story went around that wasn't ever intended for that purpose. It was intended as a quick tool for the engineers to sort of give feedback on testing and issues, right? So anyway,
Right.
so we realized at some stage that people do all sorts of things with technologies, some of which it was designed for and some of which it wasn't, and that we can't think of use as a binary on-off kind of thing, that we really have to pay attention to what's going on during use. And of course, we needed a vocabulary for that. We didn't have anything that spoke to it as much. Last episode, I briefly mentioned that at that time, a lot of our thinking, my thinking anyway, was around socio-technical systems. So the different social and technical elements and how they're connected with one another. But that's not really telling us a lot or let us deep dive a lot into what happens during use either.
It can. And so what's the alternative? I guess this is the issue that you run into. And back when I used to work for a living and wasn't an academic, right? We used to talk about the features of the software we provided, acting as if, right, those features were deterministic. If those features were there, you will use them and they will give you a nice return on your investment. So that's the way, conventionally or in practice, we think of technologies. But very early, we argued against, or folks argued against, the determinism of features. And they're like, just because there's features doesn't mean people are going to use them. Yeah. And just because there are features doesn't mean they'll use them in the same way. Different people will use SMS much differently, right? So I'll give you the lineage of Affordances theory. Well, of course, it comes from ecological psychology, but that's Gibson and all that. But the way it comes into IS, and this is at least one path, and I argue it comes from structuration. So there's structuration theory, which is, in Wanda Orlikowski's original formulation, which she later backed off from. But she had this idea that developers kind of embed some social structure into the technologies they develop. And then those technologies they develop kind of structure the practices. But so they'll enable and constrain is the word she used, right? Certain things. And that's in that way it structures. And then a couple of years later, in their famous paper on adaptive structuration theory, DeSanctis and Poole said, well, how does technology actually structure activity? And they said there's the material features of the technology, and that does this enabling and constraining. And they also had this idea of a spirit, right? The intention behind creating the technology. And it's this very vague term, mystical term, the spirit of the technology. And the features combined with the spirit is what structures the enactment, right? So that's how and of course they didn't use the term affordances. Many years later, Marcus and Silver in 2008 essentially reformulated adaptive structuration theory using the term affordances and saying, okay.
They coined it. In a way, they coined it and they made the connection to that lineage. They talked about the spirit, they talked about structuration, and then they connected it with a vocabulary that is affordances, which was basically a different stream of the literature at the time. It was there since the 70s, and it was also even used in IT-related conversations, most notably in HCI, where people talked about affordances as sort of designing into an interface possible actions for users. They made it in a very feature-centric way, sort of like make sure this button is red if it's a stop button. They talked about affordances of signaling very clearly what they want users to do when they clicked on certain elements of a user interface, right? So all of that was there beforehand. Well, I think
that's Norman, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's Norman in design, and he wrote a book on that as well, and which is different from the Gibson understanding. Anyway, so what I wanted to say. Doesn't disagree with you, but I think it's a slightly different explanation of that. I think what happened at that time, this was at the time when there was a lot of criticism about TAM and sort of this point of stopping at adoption. At the same time, we had theories of use. Andrew Burton-Jones, just a year or two before this, the paper of Marcus and Silver wrote this paper on reconceptualizing ISUs in ISR. And he said, well, there's all these different dimensions. We can't just treat it as a binary variable. And people knew that. And people also knew at the time that these build it and they will come, and IT is the silver bullet theories, that they didn't hold. We knew that at the time. The problem was that we had nothing that would allow us to sort of explicate what all of us knew at the time. We knew it wasn't deterministic. We knew it wasn't as simple as someone build a feature or a component into an IT system and then people would use it. But we had nothing to separate it. We had nothing to separate what designers build into IT and what people saw when they started working with IT, and clicking around in a system, so to speak.
And this vague spirit, I know in the Marcus and Silver is like that. Come on, what the heck's a spirit? It's some weird essence to it. It's spirit. You can't use spirit as a term. So, however brilliant DeSanctis and Poole were, there, Marcus and Silver are like, dudes, come on, we we need to put some meat around this. And the way they did it, the way it is basically interpretation. And that's the way I look at affordances is you see the technology, you see what you have to do in the world, and then you interpret the technology as being able to help you do the things you want in the world, right? Action possibilities that it enables, right?
And you know what? Like when I came across this, I saw that paper when it came on and I read it at the time, but I didn't really work with this. I started working with this with our friend Stefan in around 2009 when we started working on what would eventually become the Sustainable Practicing Green IS Affordance paper.
Sense-making affordances.
The sense-making, yeah. So because what we did, we had this study of the software vendor and we looked around and we saw what the systems were allowing them to do. Like a blind example was that they started virtual conferencing when the big bosses at the time sort of put a stop on salesmen to travel. Like they couldn't travel anywhere. They had to figure out other ways and they turned to Skype and other solutions. So I gave them these possibilities, but not everyone was doing this and other people were not doing this. So it was the same technology, the same features, and some people activated it, so to speak, and some people didn't. And we needed something that would speak to this, to this gets activated, doesn't get activated, but it's the same spirit. You do use that word. Like it's clearly for it was intended that, but it wasn't the spirit of these systems that we studied was never to become more sustainable. That was another thing, right? These were just that was just Skype, and the other thing was just a print management tool. It wasn't supposed to lower carbon emission. No one built that technology to lower carbon emission. It was just a tool to control the printer, but it was used in that spirit, so to speak, right? So we had there was the spirit of design and a spirit of use. Some people chose to activate and whatnot. And we looked around for a year or so to figure out what device can we use to speak to these differences. Mm-hmm. And that's when, we found affordances, so to speak. And I looked at it and it's like, they have the words, literally they have the nouns and they have the verbs that would speak to this. And that gives us our grounding, that gives our legitimization, and off we go and off we are up and running.
So this is the good part of affordances and the bad part of affordances. Exactly. The good part of affordances is that it gives us something to avoid the deterministic view of features, right? That it's about enacting, right, technologies and how different technologies are enacted in different ways based on who, but at the same time, they still materially impact those practices, right? And this is Leonardi's work too. He had the 2008 paper with Barley, came out at the same time. They were talking about how technology, the material features of technology afford and constrain. And then that culminated in his imbrication paper a few years later, which I think a lot of people cite for affordances, right? So that's like the foundation in this organizational and end of information systems. So then your paper on sense-making affordances, right? What did you do? You looked at an empirical situation and you identified some of those sense-making affordances. And then we saw a decade of work, essentially picking new things and identifying that, there's Elena Karahana's beautiful paper on social media affordances, right? Very recently, Jacob Steffen, a PhD student at University of Georgia, has one on augmented reality and virtual reality and the affordance. And it's kind of cool because it talks about how, virtual reality affords certain things that maybe other technologies don't, right? And there's blockchain affordances. There's all pretty much any new technology, any new context. There's our buddy Stefan actually has another paper on big data affordances.
That's right. He does. Yeah. In JMIS, absolutely.
And a bunch of others. So it's like every new trend, every new technology, every new context has a paper on this context's affordances, right? And that seems to be the new formula in a sense.
That is the new formula. And that's just exactly what I meant. And I think it goes with my explanation of what happened at the time, that people wanted a new vocabulary. They weren't interested in a particular perspective. They weren't interested in the paradigm. Like people that use affordances, they don't care about structuration. They don't read it. They just want the words. Because it became very hip, very vogue, very quickly, because it allowed us to overcome this problem of, this is not deterministic. You can't call it a feature anymore. But you can call it an affordance. So off people go and start finding them and using, basically going through their papers, search and replace, feature with affordance, and off we go. But they don't attend really to that theory, that literature that comes with this, and all the problems that exist in that particular literature either, right? And that, I think, is why it's a new TAM, so to speak, in a derogatory sense, if you want, right? In a funny sense.
Well, this is the thing that so I don't have a problem with any of the affordance papers, right? What I have a problem with is that they seem to ignore each other, right? You come up with a new affordance paper, and you don't necessarily link it to all the affordance papers that came previously. You identify the new affordances of, say, the new situation or the new technology, and then you do so again, and then you do so again. And I'm a little worried that if you look at, say, this last decade of literature on affordances, we have them. There's the Zamuto Maishak paper where it's very organizational level, the affordances, and then there's like your paper on the sense making affordances. Then there's very specific there are all these different levels of analysis of affordances. They seem to be just making their way of thinking about it using affordances, but not attending to, okay, what is the set of affordances and what are they? There's no cumulative tradition that at least I perceive in this work on affordances.
I agree. I mean, I do. I think, it makes a lot of sense that when it came up that people started basically listing what are the affordances that we have in the sort of main or emerging technologies at that time. Right. So if you think about it this way, our paper from 2013, it identified what sort of green affordances are of certain basic IT systems, of IT systems that you see in everyday organizations. So, and that's the value, and that was sort of had a point at that time, right? So if you look at who cites this particular paper, there's two types of papers that cite it. Number one, it gets cited mostly for sense making, so that's a sense making study. So people that do something about environmental sense making cite that paper. The other one is here's a paper on affordances. Here's a paper on affordances gets cited in that tradition, and
I actually like it based on for the sense making affordances. I think, I like to read and maybe write a little bit.
That's the cumulative tradition on sense making. If you think about it, that paper doesn't contribute to the affordance theory. Not at all. Absolutely not. It's a classic example of applying that theory as a framing device, looking through that lens, but not changing the lens, not developing the lens further.
Yeah. Is it a theory? I think that's a way of getting around a theory, is to say, look, this is affordances. So we throw affordances in front of it, we dress it up a little bit, and then it all of a sudden becomes theoretical. Meanwhile, it's not. We're just saying, hey, it enables people to do these things. People seem to perceive these things. Boom, we call it an affordance. Now we have a theoretical contribution, right?
So your problem is that we've produced a decade full of papers with lists of affordances, and no one bothers to check their list of affordances against existing list of affordances to see whether the blockchain affordances sort of, at least partially overlap with the affordances from, I don't know, with VR.
Big data.
That's your problem. VR. You know what my problem is? My problem with the work on affordances is that by the time the AS literature started around 2008, say, there were some well-known problems with the affordance literature. There were basically debates going on, issues. So one of them, for example, is Gibson versus Norman. The other one is, do affordances exist, or can they be perceived? Do they have to be perceived to be activated? My problem is that we haven't contributed one bit to solving any of these issues. We just used it. We've never bothered to try to figure out one existing problem and sort of contributing back to that tradition.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. There's that paper, I think, in the last year or two, Fike, F-A-I-K.
Isam Fike.
Yeah, and Michael Barrett and
Ivo Obon, right?
Where they kind of talk about the institutional context of affordances and how institutions kind of, and I like that. That goes back to that social structure roots. It's not like you plop, the problem, this is why I'm not a psychology or an individual level person, right? Where I think people perceive things and then act on them. Sure, that happens, but they do that in this context of a history and an organization and training and a profession and business processes and routines, right? So yeah, you perceive something, but you always perceive it in an established context. So in plops a new IT or in plops an existing IT. You don't just atomistically perceive it like the animal does the rock in Gibson's formulation. What you do is you're in this ongoing context. You can use the word milieu if you want to sound fancy, right? And that's where you are. And so you're always drawing on the resources and the aspects of your environment, and that's shaping how you interpret anything new. And the thing I like about this paper, Faik and et al., is that, what are you drawing on? Your institutional context, right? You're always shaped by the institutions that you're working with. Are you in academia? Is it higher ed? Well, that's shaping. That's giving you a lot of the scripts to do things, right?
Folks, this is a brilliant example of how Nick and I come from very different places. I know exactly which paper you mean, and I'm not surprised at all that you like it so much, because it speaks to your core interest about institutional theory. And I like, I like the fact that they're linking these two perspectives. But I also, admittedly, and they're great guys, and I know them reasonably well. Boy, I find that is a tough paper to read. I don't think it's easy to digest, which is in a way a problem because it's not as accessible. So it may not actually create all that impact that they deserve, because it's philosophical, it's complicated, it's not easy to digest. It's a theory paper,
Well, you're German, you're linear, you need A plus B equals C, right? That's what anything else is bullshit, which is surprising because you Germans came up with the greatest philosophers, right? I mean, although Wittgenstein was Austrian, right?
I think, right? Yeah.
But Habermas, right? Kant. Now, Hegel, by the way, you may claim him as a great philosopher, but if you've ever read Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies, he basically says Hegel was a charlatan. So Popper thinks Hegel was full of shit. And if you read excuse my language.
Full of shocks, you mean?
Full of scheisse. And he said he was a charlatan that was just trying to butter up the Bismarck regime. And he said he doesn't give him any credibility whatsoever. And in that same book, Popper dismisses Plato. He basically said Plato was a charlatan trying to, and all of his good ideas were from Socrates. And when he started writing his own stuff, he was pretty worthless. So Open Society and Its Enemies, phenomenal book. It just became popular when Donald Trump got elected here in the States.
To be honest, I've read a lot of these things that you mentioned, but I've never heard of that book. So, I'll come out here and say I did not know that, and I haven't read it, but I'll look it up.
It's a phenomenal book. It's where he calls Plato basically a charlatan. Hegel's a charlatan. Plato is just not impressive. And then he actually compliments Marx and says he was a real scientist. The only problem with Marx is when he tried to make prescriptive, he left his brain at the door when he said how we should do things. But when he analyzed the situation at hand, he thought he was brilliant. So he was actually kind of complimentary to Marx, at least to a certain extent. But
so let me get back on track by playing back what I think you just said before you dabbled into philosophy here. You basically said that, we can't overlook the history and the context. When there's a new technology with new affordances, we can't just pretend there wasn't anything beforehand, that we weren't already in a sort of, in a routine, in a particular way of doing things before, and that impacts whatever it is what we're doing now. And I agree with you. So that's one problem that we haven't attended to. Let me give you another one that always puzzled me. Now, when you look up the original ecological psychology papers and the studies, there's empirical studies there as well, and a lot of them are with primates or other sorts of animals, and they do particular physical things. They look at, what does a ball afford to an ape, or what does a table or a chair afford to these and these types of animals, right? So that's where that affordance comes from. What does the cat see in the table? He sees, it sees a bed. That sort of example. What I always thought is, that doesn't, you can't just take that and translate it. Like, we don't have physical objects. We don't have balls and sort of simple structures and things that we can climb upon or under. We have, information systems. They're interactive, they're cognitive, that we need to process information. It's completely different in my view. And no one ever has looked at that. To what extent you can sort of extrapolate from whether or not a table to two different types of animals under two different types of goals afford the same possibilities. Whether or not that's the same with me, my grandmother, and my 1-year-old baby son, play with a tablet. It's not the same thing. And, I can't take one and hypothesize about the other. Right? To me, these are fun, like digital technology objects are unlike the objects that the affordance literature, the original affordance literature speaks to. Would you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, but I also think we've kind of addressed that. Like you look at Leonardi's work and the material features and his whole imbrication model kind of has to do with that. And then again, it depends on whether you take a psychological or a social / organizational perspective. If you take a social organizational perspective like I do, you end up looking at routines and business processes and the organizational environment and the history. But if you look at psychological, so this is like that Karahana paper I mentioned before, for them it's all about what do you want to do, right? And in their paper they talk about the social media affordances, and social media can afford certain things, and based on your needs, the type of drives that you have as an individual, you might have a drive for, and I forget exactly what they had in the paper, but like a drive for autonomy or a drive for connecting. Some of us have greater needs than others, and they take a very kind of psychological cognitive view. And I guess both, right? People are individuals with their own needs and desires and goals for a thing, and they are in organizational routines trying to get the whatever.
So, but in a way, what you're saying is there's a group of psychological behavioral researchers, and they do individual level stuff, and they basically look at what are the new action possibilities, and sort of study what individuals do with them under which goals.
Individual direct perception. Right.
And then there are the organizational researchers, the guys like Paul Lenardi and others, that study sort of more collective actions and sort of, as you said, routines, sequences, patterns of things, not just one action, just, you're right. And I would say, yeah, that's right. But if you look at the, how these two camps, the social organizational people versus the individual psychology people, how they're sort of distributed in IAS, that's 90% and that's 10%, which is why on affordances we get, basically we have the Leonardi paper on imbrication. That is a paper that talks about, okay, here's a process going on with this affecting the other and vice versa over time and so forth, and it gets imbricated. That's a social organizational perspective. Yeah. That's one paper. I can give you 20 that are, here are the affordances of that feature to that particular user group on that individual psychological behavioral level, right? And I think one of the reasons is that that's just the distribution of people doing certain types of scholarship in our field, no?
Yeah, probably. But let's go back to complaining about affordances, right? So this is the issue. We're arguing that affordances are the new TAM. There was a script for TAM, right? You do a cross-sectional survey of why people are intentioning to use and whatever, perceived usefulness, that sort of thing. Now there's a new script. You pick a new context, a new technology, whatever. You go look and see what it does. And at whatever level of analysis you want, you just list some affordances. Now I'm characterizing or caricaturing this, right? So this isn't exactly how every paper goes, but this is kind of the new script, right? And then you identify the affordances. Maybe you even, and here's another side issue, Wrecker. I'm taking you on another tangent. I get a lot of qualitative papers that I review, and I've noticed, and the one that I pointed to is Ola Henfridsson, and I forget who he wrote it with, had this paper on scaling. This is the one I think of where
Jimmy Huang.
Yeah, where they did some qualitative work. Here it is. Yeah, the Growing on Steroids paper. It's
the week
2017. Paper. Yeah, and if you look at how they set up their data, they had these quote blocks, then they had these brackets going to next level codes, then they had those next level codes going to big level codes for processes. It's a beautiful paper. I think it's an important paper. I'm sure it's well cited. And I think the whole world loves it to such a degree that everybody imitates that exact same structure for every single qualitative paper I get.
Yeah, that does happen. I would agree with that. Yeah.
And they identify these new processes and they organize it exactly like that paper. So that has created the new template for qualitative research. Now you combine that with affordances, and what do? You have a bunch of quotes, you point those quotes to first level codes, and then those become big affordances, and then that's your formula. That's almost like the new qualitative affordance formula to supplant the previous a kind of survey-based TAM formula.
So you make me jump to the defense here. Just 1 second. Like I don't disagree with you. And I'm also probably like you. I'm not a big fan of templating. I think I said that before in a different episode, the one with Yang Jin, where I said, like, I'm not sure about templating how we theorize. And Yang Jin replied with, well, if this helps future generation, makes it a little bit easier for them, then that's fine. And then that's helpful and that's useful and so forth. And I do think the same goes for this particular paper. Forget about Affordance for a second, is scripting a little bit better how we write qualitative papers. So for example, in my PhD training, I told you I worked with TAM a little bit. I did cross-sectional survey, like standard method at the time. And one of the beauties about this is the papers were really relatively easy to write. You basically had a template. You can take your old paper, keep the section headings and the tables, and of course, put new numbers in there, and your variables sounded different, etc. But it was all the same, and in a way that was good. It was easy to write, so you didn't have to worry so much about narrative and problematization and where's your storyline and who's the bad guy and all these sort of writing things that we do these days. And for a long time, it was very difficult to write a qualitative paper. And I think now, over the last couple of years, maybe because of Jimmy and Ola's paper, don't know that, but there is more of a script to it.
Yeah.
And people say, like, do these things, build these data structure. We want to see that figure of your coding process, so that do this, this, and this. And people, especially younger folks, say, oh, I can do that. I can use that as a template and try to organize my own coding process along the similar lines, present it in a style that people are familiar with. And that helps. I do think that helps.
So let me give you, all right. So with that said, let's say you're right. And their paper, the beautiful thing about it is it actually generated a novel theory, right, at the back end. A lot of the papers I see get submitted don't really do that. They identify the big codes, then put the big codes in some sort of circle, and they're done. But why don't we say this? Why don't we say, okay, let's follow the Jimmy Ola template for our qualitative research. I'm good with you there, especially if it's inductive. You can have a pretty short front end. Say I'm exploring. I do that template. I have my codes. I have my, and the thing I'm identifying is affordances. I'll even give you that much. Now we identify the affordances in this context, and that's a good formulaic way to. Now the problem is that in and of itself shouldn't be enough. You have to go one step further. And I think that step further is to look at the affordances you identify, go read papers between now and 2008, identify all the similar affordances and what they write, and take those off the table, or somehow you need to situate that in the cumulative tradition. My problem is not with the structure of the way people are doing their coding and everything. My problem is then they don't situate it. They don't show how it extends what we already know. Right. So that's the missing link that I think happens in a lot of the papers today.
I completely agree. So I completely agree. Last time you asked me whether I think it's a good idea to write a theory and review paper on affordances. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I want to reiterate that. Absolutely. I think one of the most helpful things at the moment, 15 years roughly since sort of that traction got going here in IAS, someone should write this theory and review paper about everything we've done in the space of affordances, etc., and so forth, right? Like starting, I said it last time jokingly, starting with a list of every affordance that we found so far, and then organizing it by a variety of dimensions, and then picking and then sort of calling out, these are problems that are known that we should address. These are problems that are solved. These are problems that we didn't even know that are emerging now, and guide the next generation of people that are interested in affordance. I think that would be a no-brainer. And so, it writes itself, so to speak, that paper. And, it would be very impactful too. Like, why isn't anyone doing that?
Well, and part of it is levels of analysis of affordances, right? Because
that would be one of the sections.
The Zamuto paper, those are organizational level. Then there are these very, low level cognitive. Then there are, just levels so I think a theory and review paper on affordances writ large is too big at this point. You're not going to do it. You're not going to catalog. What you need to do is just pick an idea and try to do that, right? So something about levels of analysis and just think through deeply, because theory and review can't just be a review and catalog and then come up with if I got a theory and review just saying, here's a bunch of them, organize it in some way, and then here's a bunch of areas for future research, I'd be like, well, where's the theory, right? Where's the conceptual contribution? If all you're doing is organizing literature, that's not going to do much.
So,
but if you,
no, I didn't mean that. Like, I didn't mean to, like, number one, okay, this is a digress, but hear me out for a second. So we wrote a theory and review paper a couple of years ago. And it was a paper about representation theory and everything that people have done over 30 years, etc. Now, what we've done, what we actually started is we reviewed all the work that had started since 1988 or whatever it started. So we started with 1,000 paper that referenced the original works and cataloged it. And we cataloged it, and it became a 60-page paper. And it was interesting because, this is what people have done. This is sort of evidence they accrued. This is the sort of methods they use, blah, blah, blah. Descriptive, narrative, cumulative review. And we wrote it. It was literally done. It was a big paper, and we looked at it and said, like, man, we can't submit that. That never gets accepted. I mean, what are we going to do with this? And it's boring. And it is. It's vastly helpful and it's needed, but it's boring. And we didn't submit it. So what did we do? This was 3 years of work. We started afresh. We started anew and said, like, we need a theory paper, not a review paper. So we just read all these 1,000 papers and cataloged them and coded them and did all that sort of stuff. And we literally put that manuscript aside and started a new manuscript and worked a few years on getting that published. And that became a pursuing success and failure paper, I think it's called, like sort of, all right, it takes it further. It has new theoretical ideas and so forth. Okay, now we're in 2018, 5 years later, this paper finally got accepted. And then we decided, well, we still have that other paper. We have a bland review paper, not a theory and review paper, just a review paper. We should submit that too, because at the time I thought, this is going to get more traction because the other one was sort of drifting into all sorts of theoretical problems that a lot of people wouldn't be interested in, right? Yeah. So some nerds that are interested in that theory might find it interesting, but a lot of us that want to know, what do we know, what do we don't know, they wouldn't be interested. So there's got to be room for a straight up review paper. And so we submitted this, we submitted it together with the then accepted. We had to wait for the other one to be accepted before we could submit this paper anywhere, of course, right? So it was really backlog. By the time 300 new papers came out, we had to code them as well. So a lot of extra work. But then we went to JAIS and said, here's our theory paper. It just got accepted. Here, have a look if you want. Here's a straight up review paper. We think it's useful. What do you think? And they said, well, okay, a couple of rounds of review was reasonably quick. And then they published it as well. So now these are really 2 papers, right? But I think the same thing applies to the situation here. You just said a big review paper in Affordance is too big, etc. I don't think so. I think such a paper should be written. Can it be published in MISQ? Probably not. You're probably right there because they want something else. But should someone just do a straight up review? Absolutely. Would that be useful?
Cited like crazy?
Exactly. And then someone should take us, and that's an equally important, maybe even more important paper. Someone should take us to the next level of theorizing affordances. Absolutely. Does that need a review? Maybe, but that one really needs the new theoretical ideas, the new directions. The other one can actually end with a bunch of gaps that we haven't addressed yet, so to speak. I mean that sort of jokingly, but you know what I mean, right? So the one is about the reviewing everything that we know, and the other one is about here are things that are cool. And this new paper, for example, could go in. What's different about technology now? We talked about this. What's different about digital technologies that makes us wonder whether some stuff we used to say about classical IT and their affordances, where some of these assumptions, might at least be challenged, if not overturned, and then start theorizing about, I don't know, digital affordances. And just give you one idea. We know now that we don't just have human social agency. There's also material digital agency, in AI systems and robots or whatever, right? So to coin the phrase, robots need affordances too.
Yeah.
Well, are these the same? So are they goal-oriented actors? What are they, right? So is that the same thing? We can start thinking about it. And then it leads us to new theorizing.
You're trying to scoop a paper and I don't know if I should. I'm not lead author on this paper, but Thomas Grizzled and I with Stefan are working on a paper, which is exactly that, right? Affordances and autonomous tools. And it's pretty much done. I think it's waiting for me to do an edit and then we're submitting it, but
it's probably been sitting there for a month.
Oh, please.
Put Thomas, freshly minted assistant professor, needs a publication pipeline, and he decided to work with Nick, and he's just stalling everything.
I stall nothing. I prioritize junior people's work over my own. because I know their careers, right? If I'm collaborating with a junior person, I try to prioritize.
I was just making a joke, but yeah.
But here's the thing, and this goes back to the issues with review and everything else in our field, right? That it takes so long, it just destroys junior person's careers. All right, so affordances. You're very excited about the idea to do a review, and you could probably do a few different reviews from a couple of different angles. There are probably a variety of different theoretical perspectives you could bring, and I think affordances is right now the big touchstone that a lot of different, certainly the behavioral researchers, whether you're individual level or organizational level, and it's also the thing we're exporting. I know Nambasan wrote that paper in the entrepreneurship journal where they talk about affordances for entrepreneurship. So it's the thing we can bring to conversations outside of our field, and immediate and people outside of the field like affordances too.
And so we do already, right? So there's work in org science that uses affordances quite a lot, right? You've done this, Unmatchak has done this, and others. And you're right, in ETP and some of the entrepreneurship journals, people like Satish and Echo Audio and others, they've talked about digital technologies affording all sorts of new things for entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial ventures, entrepreneurial ecosystems on all sorts of levels. So this is happening, in fact,
Yeah, so I think affordances is it the new TAM in a sense that it's a unifying or foundational idea in the behavioral tradition in IS? I guess so, but it's not the new TAM in that it's not quite as formulaic. I don't think, at least it shouldn't be, and I think it doesn't have a theory necessarily. It's theoretical. It's a theoretical perspective, theoretically loaded perspective, with a lot of potential hair splitting you could do between Norman and Gibson and whatever else you want to do. But in actuality, people just use it as a way to say, this is the feature I perceive, or something like that, right?
Well, the other difference between the two is, I just looked up before the call, I looked up some of the citation numbers for some of these big papers that we mentioned, Marcus Hill, et cetera, Bali, Leonardi. And to be very honest, they're nowhere near what TAM has done in 10, 15 years. Yeah. So they're well cited. They're hitting 1,000, but they're hitting 1,000. They're not hitting 10,000. That's a big difference. Yeah. So TAM spawned a lot of, for example, another difference is TAM, especially in the early years, spawned replications, extensions, So they really systematically took the same idea, the same TAM, original 1, 2, 3, and applied it to all sorts of contexts. What with hedonic system? What if it's not email but Word? What if it's, blah, 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 very systematically, and bound up a big base of basically replicable, irrefutable evidence that it really is about usefulness and ease of use. So we shouldn't take that away.
Gender,
and no one has done that. Exactly.
Voluntary, involuntary.
For affordances, no one has done, Stefan and Jan, they identified sense making. Has someone else found the same affordance somewhere else? I haven't seen that paper. Yeah.
But it's really an unlimited list, because you can frame what you see in different terms. You can pick different levels of abstraction. You can, that's the issue with interpreting something without a really strong lexicon or ontology. The TAM has a strong ontology.
But at the same time, there's also this value in ambiguity in these sorts of concepts, right? There is some value in having a definition that is open to multiple interpretation, let's put it this way, because that also spawns fertility. If you think about performance is slightly different than me, and we both refer to the same concept and its definition, and it's sort of reasonably broad and reasonably open enough, that's actually a good thing. Right? Because that says, you can work with different optimization. We can see where that still holds, where they get inconsistent results, and, take it from there. So I always like it when some stuff is,
ambiguous.
Not as crisp. Yeah, exactly. If there's a little bit of ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity, baby. This is another problem I have with you Germans, right? You send something to German reviewers, you get define this. It's all about defining, and you need crystal clear definitions, and yeah, that's fine. And as scholars and as researchers, we should define our constructs, but at the same time, think of the De Sanctis and Poole notion of a spirit, right?
No,
that
I disagree.
Existed for 15 years. It was beautiful. It was totally ambiguous. It was not nailed down, but it was useful for getting something through by virtue of its ambiguity, right?
But
So I think affordance is the same thing. I
disagree. Sorry.
What do you disagree with?
I disagree with everything you just said. So, number one, when you said like the reviewers asked you to define your concept, I think that's fair enough. I think that's one of the common mistakes that people do when they don't do that. So, and I think there's a difference between not offering a definition versus offering a definition that is ambiguous. So, the Sanctus and Poole, they defined spirit, they left it open to. It could be all sorts of things, but there was a definition, but the definition was open and ambiguous. Exactly. And a lot of people, a common mistake is that when you use concepts and you don't define them, so we have no idea what you mean. And if you do define it, you can define it in a sort of open way and a closed way, right? Yeah. So that's a huge difference, I think.
All right, I stand corrected. You should always define it. But in having ambiguous definitions, or like what's an affordance? It's a action possibility, right? So
yeah, that's
a perceived action possibility or something like that. Fine, there's a lot of room in there, right, to play with.
So just in wrapping up, I think is affordances to new TAM. It has some resemblance, but it's not quite the same thing. I think we established that, and I think what I would like to say is, I think there's room for, number one, straight up review. I said that. I think there's room for developing affordance theory further. And I for one, would like to see the IS field go and solve some original problems with that theory. Why not? Why can't we, with us applying that theoretical device and using our vocabulary to think about and study the stuff that we're interested in, that does allow us to go back and settle some debates, such as, do affordances need to be perceived or not? Do they exist, or are they perceived? That's one of the debates. The other one,
that's going back to psychology, but I would argue one of the powerful kind of affordances of the notion of affordance is the exporting. Right. This is the way that we can contribute to other people's conversations. Take the material properties of digital artifacts and point out how those material properties might impact the world, your strategy, whatever. But they do so through this notion of affordances. And then if we actually had a cumulative tradition, right, where if we knew, we kind of knew what the low level affordances were, and we agreed on those, then we know some interim, some strategic level, right? We understood levels of abstraction of affordances, and we could export these and help people, these.
So what you're saying, affordance is the core of the discipline, is what you're saying.
Well, it's one vehicle through which we can export some of the ideas of the discipline. I don't know. But we need a cumulative tradition before we can really do a good job of doing that.
Well, you know what? Like, I'm not even sure we do. I think what we need is people that just go out and do that. And I know you're one of them. And I know that we talk about several others, Paul Leonardi and Maciek. These people.
Actually, you're writing a bunch in entrepreneurship lately, right? So
yes, a few. So I do a little bit of that. I don't think I'm in quite the same category yet, I suppose. But it would be nice if more people did this. I think there's too many people that are just within our field and just try to max out whatever they can achieve within our field. But I always thought that the beauty of our field is that it is intersectional, that it connects really readily to multiple fields, whether it be the business fields or even the engineering types of fields. And why not venture off and go to the playground to these other fields and see whether you can contribute there. I always like that idea of doing this. I'm not saying I'm good at this. There's lots of people I think are doing a great job at this, but there's few in relation to those that are, I don't mean this in a bad way, but that are just IS scholars.
All right, Wrecker, this is the interesting thing about today's podcast, and this might be a first. You're pretty much right about everything today, and I was off my game, right? The precision thing, yeah, you were right about that. Affordances, a balanced view of their potential, and you're right about that. I have to hand it to you. You were thorough today. Did you actually prepare?
I did prepare. I prepared for 2 minutes and 20 seconds.
That's preparation.
So, and
that's more than you usually do.
Exactly. That makes me an expert because I had 5 things to say and I said it all. All right. Nick, it was good talking to you.
All right. Good work today, Wrecker. I expect this type of performance in the future.
Thanks very much. Bye.